Welcome to Book Passage. Thank you very much for coming, and welcome to all the Book Passage Mystery Conference attendees. Thank you for coming. I am Cara Black, and I am honored and deeply happy to welcome back Monsieur Tony Broadbent to our hallowed shores. He's a good friend to Book Passage, a great friend to the Book Passage Mystery Conference. We're thrilled to have him back, and there's a rumor that his wife, Christine, and he may be moving back here, but Tony's a friend, a chum. I've missed him a lot, and I've really missed his really mean Michael Caine imitation. We all know that. A lot of you are his fans through his cat burglar series, the Smoke series, set in post-war London, with that wonderful cat burglar, Jethro. I was frustrated in 1964 because I wanted to meet the Beatles. I know, but I only met Brian Epstein. That's why I'm fascinated to read this story. Tony's book, just so you know, is available as an ebook from Kobo Books. The information is at bookpassage.com. And welcome back, Tony.
Thank you very much.
We love you, yeah.
My baby said she's travelling on one after 9. I said, move over, honey, I'm travelling on that one. She said, move over once, move over twice. I said, baby, don't you be so cold as ice. I said, baby, I'm travelling on the one after 909. I begged her not to go. I begged her on my bended knee. I said, you're only fooling round with me. She said, move over once, move over twice. I said, baby, don't be cold as ice. My baby said she's travelling on the one after 909. I got my bag, run to the station. The railman said, Nail, lad, you got the wrong location. Picked up my bag, ran back home. Then I found I got the bloody number wrong. Well, I said, I'm travelling on the one after 909. I said, move over, honey, I'm travelling on that line. She said, come closer once, come closer twice. I said, baby, I love it when you're nice. My baby said she's travelling on the one after 90. I said, I'm travelling on the one after 90. We said, we're travelling on the one after 909. Listen, I changed some of the words just like John Lennon used to change words in his songs. Just in case you thought I didn't know the words. What a tough audience. That's how the story began for me, oddly enough, in Greenwich Village. I was walking down Greenwich Avenue about 10 years ago. And there was a rumour, I don't know whether it was it may have been New York magazine. I didn't get Village Voice anymore, but it may have been New York. But there was a rumour. So this is how the story begins for the people who might read the book. Here, don't let the London accent fool you, because it's true. But, ladies and gentlegerms, welcome to the Iron Door Club and Rock Around the Clock, Liverpool's first ever all-night rock session, 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. You lucky people, you. And now to start the show. We're proud to present the best group ever to come out of, where was it you say you came from, Nance? That really took place 11th of March 1961. Saturday night and Sunday morning at a club called the Iron Door Club in Temple Street in Liverpool. And the Beatles weren't on for another hour yet. They're in chapter 2, if anybody was moved to buy the book. The Beatles had just been back in Liverpool, let me see, since the previous December, so only 7 or 8 weeks, and they'd appeared at Litherland Town Hall, and they were wearing dark jeans, leather jackets, and they were so tight, so loud, so pounding, the Liverpudlians thought they were a German group called the Beatles. There was an entrepreneur there, and he booked them for 6 weeks solid. Amazing. All of the entrepreneurs and impresarios and club owners in Liverpool just booked them solid. And the one you're going to hear of tonight is a guy called Sam Leach. But the Beatles had come back from Hamburg, the Kaiserkeller, the Indra clubs. And this is how the Beatles legend is supposed to have begun for real. And I've done it, and oddly enough, it's before the title of the book, if you were moved to buy a book. History tells us that an 18-year-old boy named Raymond Jones walked into a record store in Liverpool one Saturday afternoon, October the 28th, about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and he went through into North End music stores, NEMS, and the jazz and popular music was downstairs in the basement. The classical, more refined work was upstairs. He went down, 18-year-old, wearing a leather jacket, blue jeans. Apparently his father was a printer. Oh, these details, you can never make up details. And he went down and he stood in line and he approached the counter, and there was an immaculately dressed young man on the other side of it, 7, 8, 9 years older than him, immaculate on a Saturday in a shirt and a tie. And he turned to the young man and said, "Yes, what can NEMS do for you, sir?" And Raymond Jones went, "Have you got a copy of a record called My Bonnie?" And Brian Epstein went, "I'm afraid not. Who are they by?" "They're by a group called the Beatles. You probably have never heard of them." And that is supposedly what then inspired Brian Epstein within 2 to 3 weeks to search out these Beatles, become their manager, and take them on to fame and fortune worldwide. Extraordinary. Raymond Jones. Back to me on Greenwich Avenue in Greenwich Village. The rumor had come to erupt some 20 years after the band had broken up, that Raymond Jones didn't exist. He was a fabrication, a myth, made up. What's incontestable, and I even use that word in the book, what is incontestable, is that it was Brian Epstein himself who first recounted the story of Raymond Jones and the importance in the Beatles legend in a book he entitled A Cellar Full of Noise, which John Lennon later called A Cellar Full of Boys. But it was published in 1964 at the height of Beatlemania. And so the entire conceit of the book is Brian Epstein's influence on the Beatles was paramount, and it's highly unlikely you would have ever heard of the band were it not for him and all he did. So what really did happen all those years ago, and why would Brian Epstein base the legend of the Beatles upon a lie? And as it says in the book, if you move to buy one, much of what follows is true. So, that's it. I go home now. You know, John Lennon wouldn't ever wear glasses on stage. He was blind as a bat. And he'd only started wearing thick-rimmed glasses because he saw Buddy Holly wore them. But he still, that's why he'd step back like this and look, he couldn't see, everybody was just a blur. Prologue, and I love doing this because David Corbett, a great friend, hates prologues.
I like them. Liar.
And they like you back, David. Bigger than Elvis. Brian Epstein glanced down at the entry in his desk diary. "Spike, is that your real name?" "No, Mr. Epstein, it's not, no. It's what everyone's called me since I was a kid." The young man wrinkled his nose, ran a hand through his thatch of his dark brown hair. "My dad always used to say I was that daft I should have been on the Goon Show." And it sort of stuck like the Goon Show? Yeah. Yeah, you know, on the radio, Spike Milligan, Peter Sellers. They were never really my cup of tea. The boy looked around the office at the Spanish bullfight poster, beige walls, Venetian blinds, and the lightwood furniture, and burnt orange seat cushions on the couch, and he had to admit it was all very nice, if you like that sort of thing. "Well, Mr. Epstein, sir, you must be the only one in all of England who wasn't mad keen on the Goons." They were separated in age by no more than 8 or 9 years. Yet it might as well have been 30 or 40, a million. They were generations apart as they looked at one another across the cavern of years, the posh, poised businessman and the well-scrubbed scruff. Brian Epstein smiled affably. Would you mind awfully telling me your real name? I'd like to know who it is I'm thanking. Who you are, where you came from, because I want to reward you. But as I explained to Mr. Macon, that's not necessary. Yes, I've spoken to Rex Macon, thank you, but I feel the circumstance calls me to do something extra special. All I did was agree to help Mr. Epstein as a favor, like, as both Mr. and Mrs. Macon have been very good to me and my mum since my dad died. Yes, he told me about your father. I'm so sorry. I know a couple of other young people that have each lost a parent. It can't be easy. It isn't, but what's all this about, Mr. Epstein, sir? Spike? My name's Raymond Jones. A shadow crossed over Brian Epstein's face as he thought of the awful night in Hamburg. He suppressed a shiver. The thing is, Raymond, I really can't thank you enough for what you did. I didn't do anything, Mr. Epstein, really I didn't. But I was there, Raymond. I saw what happened with my own eyes. You kept it all from ending before it ever really begun. I'm sorry I don't follow. They're going to be bigger than Elvis, the Beatles, John's group. One day they're going to be even bigger than Elvis Presley. I know it, Raymond. I see it so clearly. They have the talent. Spike was on much firmer ground here. Yeah, they're great. No one can touch them. But there's hundreds of groups all around Merseyside, all of them dead set on beating the Beatles in the next Merseybeat popularity poll. Yes, I write a column for Merseybeat and know the editor personally. And I'm very well aware of all the talent in Liverpool. It's just that the Beatles are different. They're special. They have something even more important than talent. They have charisma. One can't take one's eyes off them, and as the Beatles become more and more famous, I want to ensure you're there as a part of their story forever. I'm sorry, Mr. Epstein, I still don't follow. I want to make you part of the legend, Raymond. One day I'll tell the whole story. Write a book so people will know what really happened. And I'll say you were there at the very beginning, and it was down to you that I went out and discovered the Beatles. Hopefully now, the logline on the back which says, a disaffected Liverpool teenager becomes involved with the Beatles when he's hired to help prevent the murder of the group's manager, Brian Epstein. And yes, there really was a man who threatened murder. 3 years earlier, when Brian Epstein was, how can I put it, cottaging at a public lavatory in West Derby, a man had beaten him cruelly, kicked him, knocked him senseless, robbed him of his watch, his wallet, all his money, and left him in the piss, as it were. The following day, as Brian Epstein was sitting down to tea with his parents in a very exclusive part of Liverpool, I can take the glasses, I can see you! I was just doing my John there. Turn off your phones, relax, and dig the scene. What do you think, Paul? I think it's a very good audience, John. So, this is when homosexuality was a crime, punishable by a long prison sentence. We're so forward-thinking, we Brits. And what happened was that they, in the court case that followed, Brian Epstein was called Mr. X. And they wouldn't discuss the, how shall we put it, the nefarious possible goings on. So the man was simply sent away for 3 years for robbery. The other matter was not discussed by either counsel. And so when the man was taken down for his 3-year prison sentence, he yelled out, "I'm gonna get you, Epstein, I'm gonna fucking get you. You're dead, you are." So for the next 3 years, Brian Epstein literally lived in terror and fear that he was indeed going to be got. And the man that threatened to murder him would do that. So that's what took him off to Spain. His mother sent him off to Spain to find himself. So he found bullfights and red wine, or the oca, I think the Spanish call it. They have such funny terms for wine. That's another joke, incidentally, interesting. So that's really the first mystery with the backbeat. in the book. The conceit that there really was a Raymond Jones, that he not only got involved with Brian Epstein and the Beatles, but that Raymond Jones was indeed the young lad that saw a girl across a dance floor when she was just 17. And he met her at the Tower Ballroom, New Brighton, where the Beatles were playing for Sam Leach. Paul's song, I saw her standing there, is very much one part of the book. John's first railway song, rail song, just like the great Johnny Cash and Folsom Prison Blues, writing a song about the railroad. Well, Lonnie Donegan, who first introduced skiffle to Britain in 1956 from Ken Collier's jazz band. Everything wonderful about music and the Beatles came from America. And put it this way, without American pop music, there would never have been Beatles. But anyway, what happened? Lonnie Donegan started skiffle. And he sang, and you had a washboard or a bass made out of a tea chest and a broom handle, and that's where John Lennon started. And that's where John Lennon was with a group called the Quarrymen, a group that he put together from school at St. Peter's Church Hall Fete at Woolton in 1957. So the Beatles really began when the two guys met in July 1957, where Paul, where his friend Ivan had introduced him and said, I know this guy who plays the guitar. And Paul came and he played 20 Flight Rock, which Eddie Cochran had played in a wonderful film which had just been released in Liverpool called The Girl Can't Help It. And as John Lennon would say, I've never looked at milk bottles the same since. And only you people that have seen The Girl Can't Help It will know what the hell I'm talking about. The milk bottles are up when Jay Mansfield walks by. That's another joke. Anyway, the One After 909, John's song is called One After 909. My book has a definitive article and a colon, like all good people, the One After 909. So the other great mystery was why Pete Best was sacked from the Beatles. Pete Best, who actually worked with them in Hamburg and everywhere else and on the circuit for 2 whole years before he was unceremoniously, it seemed, pushed out the group and Ringo Starr was brought in. Ringo was much more famous than the Beatles at the time. In Liverpool, Ringo was the guy. He was the drummer god. And he worked with a band called Rory Storm and the Hurricanes. And he had a 3-month stint at Butlins holiday camp. Americans don't know what the hell I'm talking about. Anyway, without those events and without Ringo starring, oh, that's a pun, a play on words, without Ringo Starr joining the group, they wouldn't ever be the band that we know them and love them as we do, oh, never mind. You know, there's a lady that comes, who shall be nameless, but she's wearing a blue t-shirt. Anyway, every time I'm here and every time she's here, she busts my chops and it's like, where's the beef? That's an American commercial for all the Brits that don't know what the hell I'm talking about. Anyway, she said, are there any dead bodies? Because mysteries have dead bodies. And I said, no, love, but there's lots of dead ends. Will that do you? That was another joke. And there are gang fights and kids get booted to death. Will that do you? You know, straight out of Rebel Without a Cause, James Dean? No? The Wild One? No?
Yes.
Okay, well, I'm glad I'm getting there somewhere. There's ageism creeping in here. The Beatles began very much with a boy from Tupelo, Mississippi, and another boy from Lubbock, Texas, and another boy from St. Louis. And of course that's Elvis, Buddy Holly, and Chuck Berry, the poet laureate of pop song. Long distance information, give me Memphis, Tennessee. I'm trying to get in touch with a party, trying to get in touch with me. She did not leave a number, but I know she made the call because a busboy took a number and he wrote it on the wall. 1957. My God. Chuck Berry, the great. And the Beatles adored him. John adored him, Paul adored him, great. And with 3 Chords and a Dream, in a sense, that's one of those seeds that all Buddy Holly's songs are 3 Chords and a Dream. John said, well, if it's just 3 Chords and a Dream, why don't we write our own? And in many ways, he and Paul deciding to do that, which was such an arrogant thing to do, an parallel thing to do. I mean, they were working class. And they were from Liverpool, and nothing good ever came out of Liverpool. I mean, everything was in London. Now, if you think of London as being the worst, well, rather the Hollywood, and let's take Hollywood, the business, the film business, the political business of Washington, and then you take the government, everything else, and you stick it in a town and call it London. London looks after its own, and it looks down on everybody else, and nothing ever good came out of Liverpool. Even the Halley Orchestra, which actually came out of Manchester, so I don't know why. That was another joke. You know, the nice thing by setting that up, when I get it wrong, I can say, of course, that was another joke. But, Lonnie Donegan, wrong island. Oh! And here I've got to the thing about characters that you've never heard of. It may surprise you. It may surprise me if I can find the right page. Okay, here we go. Who is the book dedicated to? For John, Paul, George, and Ringo, and Brian Epstein, and George Martin, and Sam Leach, and anyone that's ever loved the Beatles. Well, who the hell is Sam Leach? Even McCartney, Paul McCartney, says that the early years of the Beatles are the Sam Leach generation. That's the Sam Leach time. You've never heard of him. Even most Beatleologists have never heard of Sam Leach. But he was the Bill Graham. He was Liverpool's Bill Graham. He was the only impresario that had a dream for the Beatles as big as Brian Epstein later had. And he's being written out of Beatles lore. So in fact, when I finish doing the website dedicated to the book, there will be an element in there called SOS, which is Save Our Sam for Beatles History. And you will be able to email your address in, and we're going to send it to Liverpool County Council and say, hey, we want a road or a roundabout or a bloody building for Sam. And if were you to buy the book, purchase it for real money. You know, I'm just following John Lennon here. He used to sing about money, and he said, that's what I want. At a press conference, he said, don't you think it'd be rather good if you actually would be able to walk down the street and be unrecognized? And John Lennon said, we've already done that with no money in our pockets and there's nothing in it. Isn't that great? Lennon gets the laugh and I've got to explain what to do. So you have Sam Leach, irrepressible. There's a place in New Brighton, just across the Mersey, the River Mersey, and New Brighton was the Coney Island of the northwest coast, and it fell on bad times. But at one time, they had a tower there that was the rival of the Eiffel Tower in Paris, and I throw that in for Cara. You know, just anything to do with France gets her going. That's it. Anyway, it was then dismantled after the First World War because they couldn't afford to keep it going. And what was left was a 4-story building that really it was the biggest dance hall in the north of England. 5,000 people. The Cavern could hold about 200 if you put them in. And so Sam Leach, who was just this wonderful working class nutcase, complete nutcase, who had irrepressible, wonderful, towering, that's a pun, towering dreams, was the guy that set this first all-night rock session at the Iron Door Club. And when he got pushed out by all the other impresarios, he went farther and farther afield till he found the Tower Ballroom, and he set up what they call Operation Big Beat. That's actually written about in the book, if you're okay. But there are other people. There's Stu Sutcliffe, John Lennon's friend from art school, who died of a brain hemorrhage in Hamburg. Who else have we got? Oh, it's Pete Best. We've still left Pete Best. He's getting thrown out, remember? We've got Neil Aspinall, who was, I think, the lodger at Pete Best's mum's house, and she's called Mo. Remember that bit where Paul McCartney says, okay, Mo, that's Mo Best. You don't know what they're talking about, do you? It's all right. Don't nod your head if you don't. So you've got Bill Harry. He started Mersey Beat, the great publication. You've got Bob Wooler. Rory Storm. This is one of these Elvis characters, a man that stuttered when he spoke. Couldn't get 2 words out together without stuttering, but the moment he sang, they said he was as good as Elvis. He really was. And Rory Storm is reborn in the book as well, if you were to purchase it, that is. And then you've got Rex Macon, who's referred to in the beginning of the book, who was the family solicitor that Queenie Epstein called upon to help her son through these terrible times. And then you've got Astrid Kircher, this wonderful young woman who was a photographer, an art student in Hamburg, that took the most extraordinary photographs of the Beatles before anybody had ever heard of them. And they're wonderful, from the Dom Fairground outside Hamburg. And if you ever go back or you go onto Google, look at some of these photographs. They literally are the first modern rock photographs, rock and roll photographs. They're just superb. Astrid Kircher. And there was Jürgen Vollmer as well that was there. And why Jürgen? Because when John and Paul skipped off to Paris because they were so bored and so frustrated and they thought they were going to give it all up, they took some money. There's a guy yawning. I know I'm doing bad. I'm going to pick up the pace now. They went to Paris, and it was Jürgen. It was there in Paris that they were having this Beatle haircut, where it was then called a klopsen. Klopsen.
Yeah.
Anyway, they combed their hair forward. Got nothing else to do. Let's comb my hair forward. So they came back, and there it was, the Beatle haircut born. So, and I've got imagined characters, which is, all the rest of the faculty are going, well, at least he's now making up a bloody character, not stealing it. About time. Yeah. So I've got Harry Lightfoot. Well, what else are you going to call a private investigator but Harry Lightfoot? Oh, never mind. And Jimmy Mooney. And Sandra Dudley. And the Joker, who just does what he pleases. Never mind. You've got to know your Beatles to know that. And the clubs, the Cavern, the Tower Ballroom. It's not long now. I've only got not long. And so, even though now, 50 years later, what happens? There were 5 lightning flashes that produced the Beatles. That day at Wilton Church Fete, the St. Peter's Church Fete in Wilton, where John met Paul and Paul played 25 Rock. Oh, and he could tune a guitar, so he tuned John's guitar, who'd been playing on a banjo stringing. And about 10 days later, a friend of theirs called Ivan Vaughan was cycling through one of the parks, and he said, "Hey, John, I want you in the band." And that was it. So Paul came in, because he could sing 20 Flight Rock, just like Eddie Cochran, and he knew the words and the chords. And John said much later, well, it was my band, but he could, he'd be much stronger with him. So that was it. It was either me being the big cheese or him being in the band and the band being better. And that's what we did, invited him in. So on the way to school, Paul would sit on the top deck of the double-decker bus, and there was this young 15-year-old lad, was he 14? I think he was 14, called George Harrison, who took his guitar out and they'd play, and he could play raunchy. Dum 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 diddly. Anyway, Paul said to John, "Hey, he can play raunchy. What do you think?" And John said, "I'm not having him in the band. He's a child. He's 14. I'm 16." Anyway, George Harrison joined the group. John, Paul, George. The Pete Best years we'll just go over for a moment. But it was in fact George that pushed and pushed and pushed both Paul, then John, then Brian Epstein, to have Ringo join the group. So you've got John, Paul, George and Ringo, then you've got 2 men, and again without whom you would never heard of the Beatles. That's Brian Epstein, who was just sheerly brilliant, way before his time, and the great George Martin, the producer, who was in charge of a comedy record label called Parlophone. Absolutely nobody bought anything. Unless you like Peter Sellers and the Goon Show, then you buy something from Parlophone, but other than that, nobody. I mean, Parlophone, that's such a rubbish label. And the thing that happened was that Brian Epstein, when he took on the Beatles, used every contact he had to try and get them a job down in London. And by job I meant a record contract, because that's what the Beatles wanted. They were frightened that they would never succeed, and without a record contract they would never go anywhere. They were even thinking up stunts, what to do to try and make themselves more famous. And John and Paul were going to swim the Mersey to the other side and then come out and go ta-ra with the Beatles or the Noak twins. That's another thing for Beatleologists, because they actually worked as the Noak twins for some time. So there it was. They were bored. They were on the verge of breaking up. And Brian Epstein took nearly 9 months to succeed by getting them an interview with George Martin down at EMI at Abbey Road, Parlophone in London. So, Brian Epstein, the fifth Beatle. Lovely story. Brian Epstein had gone to the cabin and had introduced himself. Actually, Bob Wooler, the DJ, introduced him, and he blushed bright red. And what happened was that he invited them to come to Nems, to his office, over the record store. And 3 of them duly arrived. John arrived, Paul arrived. No, John arrived, George arrived, and Pete Best, because Ringo wasn't with him. So you've got John, George, and Pete Best. And Brian Epstein said, well, where's Paul? And John said, well, I don't know, he's probably not wound his watch. So after 15 minutes, Brian Epstein said, well, will you give him a call? So George went out to the office, called Paul McCartney's house, and then came back, closed the door, turned around and sat down and said, he's just got up from a bath and he'll be here soon, because he had a sleep and then he thought he needed a bath and he's just toweling off at the moment. And Brian Epstein went, what? He'll be terribly, terribly late. And George Harrison said, yeah, but it'll be very clean though, won't it? True story. When the Beatles were introduced to George Martin at Abbey Road, George Martin was not really impressed with their demo disc at all. And he wasn't overly impressed when they ran through 4 or 5 numbers for them down in Studio B. Anyway, he invited them up to the control room and he played a few things back and he said, look, let's get things right from the start. I'm going to explain what the recording process is and what you have to do and why we have to do the drums, or you can get another drummer. But he spent an hour taking them through the whole process of what they did, what they needed to do, and how they did it, and what sliders and what controls did what in the control room, and how they got the sounds. And it was a 4-track machine. No, let me go back. It was a 2-track machine. They didn't go on to 4-track until they did Sgt. Pepper. So that's 2 tracks, and you put those down, and you put it onto another 2-track machine, and put those down, and you put it onto another 2-track machine. Sorry, there I go again. It's a mistake. A deliberate mistake. They didn't do 4 tracks until Sgt. Pepper. Now I've got John Cross, a mate here as a musician. They got bloody 148, 220 million tracks. Anyway, I'm losing people already. Yawning. I've got your name. So there they are. Brian and George Martin, who sounded very posh, rather like Brian Epstein, said, "Look, I've been talking to you for an hour. Now, if there's anything you don't like about it, or anything you don't like about me, tell me now. Let's get it out into the open right from the start. So, anything you don't like about it, talk now." Silence in the control room. Brian Epstein, George, John, Paul, and Pete. And George Harrison said, "Well, for a start, I don't like your tie." True story. And in such moments like that, the Beatles proved themselves to be irrepressible, irascible, invincible, and impossibly talented. So, what I'm going to do here now is take you to, because there's a guy here called John Askins. John, are you here?
Oh, yes.
Could you stand up and take a bow, please? You don't know why this, do you? John was a cub reporter in Atlanta. Was it 64 or 65?
65.
65. When they interviewed the Beatles.
Press conference.
Press conference, so there you go. Just something, because this is the magic, and like the music, it never goes away. The press. What do you think of the criticism that you're not very good? George Harrison, we're not. Press, What started the practice of wearing 4 rings? Ringo. 6 got to be too heavy. Press. Do you speak French? Paul McCartney. No. One of my favorites. Girls rushed towards my car because it had press credential identification on it. So they obviously thought I'd already met you. How do you explain this phenomenon? John Lennon. You're very lovely to look at. The press. Do you wear wigs? John. If we do, they must be the only ones with real dandruff in them. I should have done this from the start to remember. Press. Just great, yeah. Were you worried by the gang of oversized roughnecks who tried to infiltrate the... I can't do an American... These are all American press instead. Were you worried by the gang of oversized roughnecks who tried to infiltrate... That's pretty bad, eh? No?
Pretty bad.
Okay.
Stay with what you got.
Yeah, I can't do it. My wife keeps telling me that, but she's an American. I do a great John Wayne. Can't do it. I even do a Robert Mitchum walk. No, she says, I'll divorce you. Okay, let's go back to then. Let's think it's Hard Day's Night, and we've got all those snotty people going. Were you worried by the gang of... It sounds much better, doesn't it? Were you worried by the gang of oversized roughnecks who tried to infiltrate the airport crowd on your arrival? Ringo Starr. That was us.
Oh, that's great.
What do you do when you're cooped up in a hotel room between gigs? We ice skate. George Harrison. Another one from John coming. Press. Are you afraid military service will break up your careers like Elvis? No, there's no draft in England now. We're going to let you do all the fighting for us. And then this one. What would you do if the fans got past the police lines? George Harrison. We'd die laughing. And then from 1963, John. You can be big-headed and say, yeah, we're going to last 10 years. Then as soon as you've said that, you stop and think, we'll be bloody lucky if we last more than 3 months. So, what should we do? I can finish it off or do another reading. There's a little reading for when Brian Epstein gets them to play a television show called Thanks for Lucky Stars. If you'll indulge me for 4 minutes, I'd like to read it. You know, I found that across the street there, 50 years after the event, published this year. Why the Beatles?
How the Beatles.
I know, it was a mistake.
Not allowed. Not allowed.
Or was it? How the Beatles changed the world and my life. There we go. Bear with me. I'm putting on my John Lennon granny glasses. I know the author. So does Riz Bowen. My friend. Hey, Riz sang with Paul Simon. At Bunge's Coffee House in London.
Yeah. At the same time as Tony. We never met. Well, perhaps we did meet.
Yeah, did he sign you up?
We're not talking about it. Not with your husband and my wife. So here, imagine if you will, Granada Television out of both Manchester and Birmingham. It's the central television agency. It's nothing to do with London. They're not as good as London, you see, because London does look down on anything from the door. Anyway, there it is. It's out of the Birmingham studios this time. And it's Thank Your Lucky Stars every Saturday. And if you got on Thank Your Lucky Stars, you'd have a hit. And Brian Epstein, by hook or by crook, had gone to see a man called Dick James, who was just fiddling with paper clips. And Brian Epstein had been turned down then by 30 or 40 different officials at 4 or 5 different record companies, and he still couldn't get anybody to do a damn thing. And Dick James listened to a song called Love Me Do, and he liked it. And then he heard a song called Please Please Me. And he said much later, he said, my heart couldn't stop banging. I knew it was a hit. And in front of Brian Epstein, he called up a friend of his, a producer of Thank You Lucky Stars, and played it over the telephone. And he got a gig there 10 days later. And this is the weekend before, when they're going to record the show on videotape for performance the following Saturday. So this is Brian, and I've cut it down here for a bit, but let me see. So what he's done, he's asked the lads to try and take their nerves. I wish somebody had done that to me earlier on. Try and keep their nerves down. He's talking to them, and I'm picking it up where he says, what about you, Paul? Said Brian softly. Me? Well, Brian, I think the same as George. No, let's do Paul. Well, me, Brian, I think the same as George. This is Paul, you see. Paul's like this. It can't last forever. Maybe 3 or 4 years if we're dead lucky. But I'll go on writing songs with John, whatever happens. I love doing that. Then who knows, maybe even do a musical or something. That'd be good. Anything really, just as long as I can keep on performing and playing music, because I love doing that. John Lennon snorted. Yeah, I can see it, the two of us walking down Tin Pan Alley with all the other boring old farts. Paul looked at him sharply. No, don't worry, Paul, it's just me being me. We'll run ring rounds, the bloody lot of them we will. And we'll dance all the way to the bank too. We'll rake in the bloody money and we'll be bloody millionaires, all of us. You will, you know, you will, Brian said, looking at each one of the Beatles in turn. I believe there's absolutely nothing now that can stop you. You can be as big as you want, for as long as you want. Be bigger than anyone has ever dreamed of. Right, said George, I think I better go and have a quick pee. With all this water I've been drinking, I wouldn't want to start to look as if I've been caught short when I start banging my feet in time when we get out in the studio. Yeah, good idea, La. Always go where nature calls, said Ringo. It's the natural thing to do, said Paul. Lead on, Macduff. George, Ringo and Paul pulled agonized faces, filed out of the dressing room and went in search of the toilets. John wrinkled his nose, turned and peered at Brian. What did you mean, Eppie, when you said you can be as big as you want for as long as you want? Don't you ever think we'll want it to go on forever? The lightning is about to come out of the bottle, John. The Beatles are about to electrify the world, and you're the only ones who can ever stop it, or ever break it apart. No one else can, not even me. So you're saying we're all stuck with one another, Eppie? That's it exactly, John. Somehow Ringo was the perfect finishing touch. It's odd, but something extraordinary happens now when you all start playing together. It's as if you're complete somehow. You don't look as if you need anyone or anything, and what's more, it looks as if you don't give a damn about it. What anyone might think about any of it, or you. And that's what makes you all so attractive to everyone. That the only thing the rest of us can do now is stand back and watch and listen in awe. Bloody hell, Eppie. I thought we were just a band that wanted to get big enough to get out of Liverpool and go to the top of the pops in London. It's funny though, isn't it? It's dead funny what you're saying. George says it feels odd sometimes when we start to play. It's like we're all one person. The four of you are simply perfect together, John. You're the whole thing, complete, in the way that you look and the way that you sound. I've always thought of the Beatles as being a bit like a gang, and not one of us is the Beatles. We all are. To me, it's the group as a whole that's important, as none of us can do it on our own, not me, not Paul, not George, not Ringo. And you're right, it does seem as if we've been looking for the perfect drummer from the very beginning. So yeah, Eppie, the Beatles is all four of us, and always will be. All for one and all that stuff. George is right, John. You do all come together like one person. He paused. George is unquestionably the soul of the group. Paul is the heart. Its heart, welcoming, ever beating. Its ever beating heart. And Ringo is the body, its flesh and blood, its bones and its sinews. And you, John, you're its mind. Bright and piercing and perceptive, and you always will be. And if ever one of you stops or leaves or breaks away, there'll be no more Beatles. And the whole magical thing will fall apart, and the whole world will be the poorer for it. Blimey, Eppie, I think I need to go and have a pee now. Otherwise I'm not sure which will burst first, You try saying burst first. Otherwise I'm not sure which will burst first. Me bladder or me bloody head. I'll be back in a minute. Then I think I need to ask everyone just one more time where we're all going to. I'll pour us some more water so we can all toast to the future together. But from now on I promise it'll only be the very best champagne all the way. It better be, Eppie, it better be, for all our bloody sakes. Brian Epstein sat alone, but he no longer felt alone. He was as close as anyone could ever be to the Beatles, without actually being a Beatle. And there was nowhere else he'd rather be, or anyone else he'd rather be with. The boys completed him too. They made him feel whole. With the Beatles, the missing part, deep, 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 deep down inside him, was at last fully fulfilled. Well, she was just 17. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And the way she looked was way beyond compare. Now, I'll never dance with another, not since I saw her standing there. Well, she looked at me, and I could see that before too long I'd fall in love with her. Now, she'll never dance with another, not since I saw her standing there. Well, my heart went boom, 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 boom when I crossed that room. And I held her hand in mine, and we danced through the night, and we held each other tight. And before too long I did fall in love with her. Now I'll never dance with another, and she'll never dance with another. We'll never dance with another, not since I saw her standing there. And I'd like to say thank you very much, and I hope me and the group pass the audition one after another. And they're going to throw us out now, are they?
No!
No?
No.
What do we do now?
You're allowed a question.
Oh,
You
question.
have to answer some questions,
Say
lad.
Apparently I'm allowed a question or two.
Are we
Thank you very much.
Are we supposed to sing and we love you? Yeah, yeah, yeah. First.
Wouldn't that be? Yes. We moved to North Carolina. We're coming home. Anyway, the first day we moved in, there were 3 church groups came and approached us. And they said, I'm a member of a church. What church? And I said, true story, I'm in the church of John Lennon. And as their eyeballs moved, I said, all you need is love. We've never seen half the hair of the Anyway, any questions for anybody? Ah, the man, the handsome man over there.
Knowing your obsessive behavior, have you always been interested this much in the Beatles? I mean, or is this something that...
No, absolutely. I was, I think, a 13-year-old teenager. I had a girlfriend, and in her popular weekly girls' paper, there was a photograph of these 4 lads in Liverpool. I hadn't heard a damn thing at that point. And they were on a bomb site. And there was no battered car in the background. And I went, who are they? They look cool. Well, within a year, I hitchhiked to Hamburg with a friend of mine who ended up as a drummer in the school band. And that was it. My mum and dad bought me a guitar, an amplifier, the Beatles' first LP. I had Love Me Do. And it was away and running. And I'm glad to say that from being a straight A student, what do they call it, 4A or something, I don't know, I plummeted to the bottom of the class. I combed my hair forward. I began doing French in a Liverpudlian accent, Je suis tout a il sang. And was what they call in British schools rusticated for it. I was sent into detention for months because I refused to give up. And my full name is Paul Anthony Broadbent. So I went home and I said to my mum, I want to be called Paul now. And she said, why? I said, I just do. I just got this feeling that Paul's a good name to have. And God bless them, they did. We lasted. Apparently they giggled behind their hands for months. But I tell you this, I really started getting girls. So yeah, lifelong. And what it is that if the Beatles opened a door in England, it meant that the working class kids could get out, and if you weren't a boxer or an athlete, or joined the army, it was very difficult to get out. And what had happened in London, Michael Caine, Terry Stamp, Vidal Sassoon, David Bailey, it seemed that the doors were opening. And these kids, from these working class kids, think about this, they didn't give a damn about sport. I beg your pardon. We invented sport with the English. They didn't give a damn about sport. Oh, and make this thing about, think what the draft did to Elvis. They missed the draft by 3 months. Otherwise, John Lennon and Ringo Starr into the army. Could you imagine that? I know that John played in How I Won the War for Dick Lester. Thank you. Much later, and you see him with his head shaven as a private. But that was it. They missed the draft. They didn't like sport. They just loved music. Ringo, because of childhood diseases, had virtually no education at all, and so music was his only way out. But even he had been around the circuit in the best bands in Liverpool, didn't know where the hell he was going. George was an apprentice electrician and gave that up. You know, if somebody had only had a Beatles song on their phone. John had only got into the local art institute through Queenie, his auntie, begging for him to be taken in. And Paul's dad was a musician. Paul learned to play the trumpet and everything else, naturally gifted musician. But basically, Paul gave up his chance of going to university just to be in the band. So in a sense, it was make or break with them. And Malcolm Gladwell, who I yield to no man in my admiration for him and his essays, brilliant young man, and a Canadian too. But he says they were good because they did 10,000 hours. Bollocks. They were good because they decided to write their own music. They were good because they did things that nobody other bands are doing. Jerry Marsden, Jerry and the Pacemakers, Tony Sheridan, Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, they played as long and as often in Hamburg as any of the Beatles, and guess what? They're not the Beatles. It's the arrogance of John and Paul beginning to write another Lennon-McCartney original and following Buddy Holly, 3 Chords and a Dream, and writing down. There was a song he wrote called Like Dreamers Do, which came out on one of the anthology series, and it was that was when Brian Epstein had some tapes, and he took them into the HMV store, just a music store, on Oxford Street, and a friend of his, a colleague, changed them into 78 RPM acetates, and it was one of those songs, Like Dreamers Do, on those new 78 RPM records, that a music publisher called Sid Coleman, who happens to be in the book if you were to buy the book. Anyway, Sid Coleman then called George Martin and said, I'm not going to, from God, there's this young man here called Brian Epstein, and he's got this group of his called the Beatles. Oh, the Beatles. You know why they were called the Beatles? Because of Buddy Holly and the Crickets.
I thought it was the beat.
It was, but that was John, because our John's clever with words. But he changed the Beatles, E to EA. So it's just that. It's the magic of Buddy Holly and Chuck Berry and Elvis, and the fact that Paul and John had the audacity to write their own songs and want to sing and play them. And it's those little bits of what is it? They once asked Picasso, Monsieur Picasso, he says this in my French accent. I can do French better than that. And this is Monsieur Picasso, even though he's a Spaniard. You're looking at me ugly.
Very critically.
Thank you, yes. Get off. Do you believe in luck? And he said, may we? Or whatever may we is in Spanish.
Sí.
C. ABC. But when it arrives, it has to find you working. Thank you, Pablo.
Do you think they would have been as popular if they were called the Worms or something? Because I mean, if they were a bug.
Incestuously speaking, I have no idea. But I'm only glad that they were called the Beatles. I can't imagine my life without them. They've been such a joy, they continue to be. I stand in awe at what they did in 7 years. They'd been going for 7 years before they exploded on the Ed Sullivan Show.
Yeah.
But I mean, imagine, there it is, they've been invited, they've done Sunday night at the London Palladium, which is the equivalent of Ed Sullivan Show. And they're so big, so sudden, that they're invited to do the Royal Command performance in front of His Majesty the Queen. And so out they come, and before they do twist and shout, and you know all this, John goes to the front of the podium, and he looks around, and you've got London, splendid, bejeweled, all the nobs and the lords and the ladies, and Her Majesty the Queen and her retinue. And he said, if you people in the cheap seats will just clap your hands, and the rest of you just rattle your jewelry. And the wonderful thing is, nobody had ever done that in front of Her Majesty before, and certainly not anybody from Liverpool. And it's that, and the press releases that the press interviews that I did before, it was genuine and it was strange, but the four of them together, nothing could penetrate that. And even the jaded press corps in New York, when they first arrived, couldn't believe it, because it was coming back. Those hadn't been practiced. That was the whip that was coming back fast and furious, but it was the four lads. And that's why I adore A Hard Day's Night, which came out just over 50 years ago, in 2014. And Dick Lester and the screenwriter, Alan Owen from Liverpool, were just marvelous in that they shot it, and oddly enough, in black and white. If they'd done it in color, it just wouldn't be the same. Because when the boys come on the television screen or whatever, and they're there, it's just miraculous. It certainly is. And it is true that A Hard Day's Night was one of Ringo's malapropisms. And so it was just magical. And I still delight, and I can see that. And as I forget now who was the music critic for the Village Voice, but he called A Hard Day's Night the Citizen Kane of jukebox movies. And the great, much missed Roger Ebert said he calls it one of the most unquestioned joyful movies of the 20th century. And the British Film Institute has marked it as one of the top 100 films in British film history. So, and it was made on a shoestring for £200,000, there and half $500,000. It was shot in 7 weeks. It was produced from start to finish, written start to finish in 16. It was just extraordinary. Oh, and it's the only film in film history that made more money before it opened and made all the money back. So, and the only reason that United Artists wanted it was to get a soundtrack out of it. It was just going to be one of these pop group films that appeared and disappeared. I'm so glad it didn't, and I'm so glad you came tonight. Thank you very much.